In this video, I'm going to show why libertarians are full of shit, essentially. I'm going to start by talking about some Marxist ideas, specifically materialism. I'm going to explain what that is, and then show the vacuous void that libertarianism exists in. Just keep in mind, this isn't about being a Marxist scholar. I'm not going to go that deeply into it. This is a more basic introduction to certain ideas, and I'm hoping that it's a little bit entertaining to people. But what is historic materialism? Well, it's basically an idea that the material world in which people live in molds their ideas. So there's an image of prehistoric hunter and gatherers, and I just want people to understand that the fact that these are hunter and gatherers, that they lived in such an environment that supported them, that they had such a degree of technology, would then inform and mold their ideas regarding social relationships, morality, ethics. Their whole worldview is going to be shaped by the material world that they are living in. Then we can move on to agriculture, where suddenly you had a product which could be hoarded, and it allowed for a centralized authority. So this would change people's worldview. Now you could have a city-state. Now you could have people like a pharaoh ruling all over subjects. The hunter-gatherer society is based more upon equality and people working together in small groups. Agriculture produces an authoritarian society, and that's because of the material conditions that people live in. We can also see how material conditions affect religion, such as the formation of Judaism is based upon people living in a desert, a patriarchal war god, which is what Yahweh, the Jewish God, descended from. We have things like circumcision, which is a ritual scarring, so you know who's in the tribe and who's outside the tribe. That has to do with the material conditions of being at war against outside enemies and wanting to be exclusionary towards them. We get these founding myths of God's people, of former slaves, and that myth has a social function of social unity. But in order for that founding myth to take hold, you need to have a group of people living in such an area where there's a need to have that myth. So as much as the ideas in Judaism have shaped the Jewish people over the years, it is also the material conditions in which the ancient Jewish people lived in, which informed their religion. And it's not one or the other. It's not that material conditions control everything. It's not that our ideas or ethics control everything. It's that both of these will influence each other. We can look at slavery and racism. Black people weren't enslaved because of racism. Black people were enslaved because there was a need to find a cheap source of labor, and once they were enslaved, racism was created to justify it. And I think today, from an historic materialism perspective, we need to ask the question, do police target black people because they are racist? Or are the police racist because they target black people? I mean, we live in a class system where the police go after poor people to put them in jail for corporate profit. Is it any wonder that police officers, regardless of their own skin color, will develop an ideology of hatred and prejudice against poor people? This also brings up the question, how far are we going to get fighting racism unless we fight the material conditions that propagate racism? I'd argue from not just a Marxist perspective, but I think from a basic sociological or psychological perspective, that we can't study anything about humans without looking at the environment that they live in. And that is especially true when it comes to ethics, morals, and ideas. Looking at the text, it might be a little confusing, but a priori means something that is supposed to be there originally. Like before looking at the world and extrapolating from the world what reality is and making conclusions based upon observation. A priori is just something that's supposed to be almost primordial, just there, that you can just reason. And what we see is many religions, including capitalism, that I would definitely categorize as a religion, it preaches ethics based upon bullshit philosophy, rather than actually looking at the material world. Let's get into some examples of this. If we go to some Islamic countries, we see this continued barbaric religious punishment going on, such as beating people because of infidelity or because of homosexuality. So Islam claims to have an eternally correct set of morals or ethics that is handed down to them by God. And part of this would be that these ethics must never change because this is eternal. This is coming from the final prophet. And so therefore Islam makes the claim that changes in our environment, whether our physical environment or technological changes, that those in no way should really affect our ethics at all. That the two are separate because Islam claims that the ethics are eternal and perfect and come from God, and Allah, gave, Muhammad, the final revelation. So, just as a side note, if someone is a Muslim, then either you have to renounce Islam or you have to renounce Marxism, and actually not just Marxism, but being on the left entirely, because they are completely incompatible. Because Marxism is based on historic materialism, and Islam is based upon this idea of the eternal, never-changing morality. And you cannot square that circle. So what I want to point here is the disconnect between the ideas and what people are doing. Because why do you care if someone else is gay? Why is that a morality? Why are you doing this? Well, a historical materialist will say people are doing this because of the life conditions in ancient Arabia which form their ideas. Islam says people are doing this because Allah said to do it. And this leads to cultural lag, and that is when material conditions change, then the changes happen in the adaptive culture. But the changes in the adaptive culture don't happen at the same speed as the material changes. There's a lag. The material conditions change, and then eventually culture adapts. But in the meantime, a lot of suffering happens because people won't change their ways. This brings up the subject of objective morality. Morals are inherently subjective. However, some ethics are more appropriate in terms of promoting physical and emotional well-being. So, for example, when it comes to spanking, well, spanking is basically causing brain damage in a child. Well, that we can say that that's not really functional if you want to have an intelligent, emotionally functional adult. However, maybe it's dependent upon the environment. Maybe in certain environments, children should be beaten in order to give them brain damage. That way they can be better adapted to a hostile and violent world where they need to be crazy. Point is, you can't say that there is a objective morality. It's all based upon humans coming up with ideas in order to mold their behavior to the environment. So why do we have specific morals? Well, it's not because anything is objectively right or wrong. Those ideas don't make any sense. There's no such thing as right or wrong. That's nonsense. But there is social function, and some things have a better social function than others. That's why we have all these ideas about sex and morality. It's not because any sex act or sex acts with different people is inherently right or wrong. It's because it has such a big effect on society. And if you can create an ideology which controls people's sex, you're now controlling social relationships and you're controlling reproduction. Okay, so to repeat, objective morality does not exist, but all religions claim it does, and that they are the ones who know that it's objective. I mean, if someone's talking and they come up with their objective morality, that's when I know I'm listening to a crazy person. I need to go the other way. Morals should be judged on their social function. Do they enhance physical well-being, emotional well-being, and happiness? And of course, the validity of the morals is subject to change based upon changes in the material environment. Marxists care about how technology changes social organization and social relationships. In medieval times, when you had some blacksmith making stuff by hand, you're going to have different social organization than 200 years later when you have, industry going on. Libertarians, on the other hand, reject historic materialism. They have these ideas such as self-ownership, or you own the product of your labor. You have right to sell your labor. They have this non-aggression principle. All of these arguments are not based upon the material conditions in which people live. They don't look at the environment. They don't look at technology. They don't look at how that affects social relationships and the need for labor. None of that matters to their ideology. That we have all these jobs today that have no social, technological function doesn't mean anything to libertarians. In fact, that most jobs to just be eliminated without any change in how society functions from a material perspective doesn't matter to libertarians. And the fact that just because a corporation makes money, that doesn't mean there's a rational function for a job to exist. Again, that doesn't matter to libertarians. Here's a Coke ad. The fact that there's no objective need for a Coca-Cola ad or to make Coke at all because it's just toxic garbage doesn't matter to libertarians. We can have a mail carrier delivering junk mail for a living. Outside of the realm of libertarian philosophy, they're not contemplating it because they just assume that people have to work for a living. We could have some cop going around who looks like they're military personnel, just corporations making money by selling police these weapons in order to control poor people. Outside of the philosophy of libertarians, the fact that this police job doesn't need to exist, they'll just blame all problems on the government. What about telemarketers? Do we need random people calling you up to sell you crap? Well, that's outside of the philosophy of libertarians. What about casinos? That's another example of a completely worthless and pointless job. Why do those exist? Stockbrokers, I don't see them making anything in the material world. I don't see them actually providing any useful services. Why do we need them? Market research people, why should they exist? They're just there to psychologically manipulate people into buying stuff. There's no objective reason for these jobs. Yet libertarians can't contemplate this. Libertarians think they have some brilliant philosophy based upon a priori knowledge. But what I was trying to do with the comparison to our official religions is that this a priori knowledge is not a priori knowledge at all. It's complete bullshit made up by people living hundreds if not thousands of years ago based upon the material conditions of their surroundings. There is no a priori knowledge. And libertarians confuse a priori knowledge for ad hoc justification for the status quo. That's why we have all these ideas that don't make any sense. The non-aggression principle, for example, does not account for the coercion put on individuals to sell labor. You can't go out into the woods or the forest and survive by the means of your own subsistence, basically. You can't just labor away because other people own that stuff, by the way. And the reason that capitalism was able to get started was by kicking peasants off their land and telling them, no, you can't go out and do your own. You have to work for us. That type of coercion doesn't exist in the minds of libertarians because it's just ad hoc bullshit. They have this notion of self-ownership. They go on about it, how obvious it is everyone owns themselves. But ownership denotes property relationships, and those don't exist in nature. Furthermore, I want to get into this idea that our economy functions as if we're nothing but small craftsmen. There on the left is a picture of colonial America, and libertarians seem to have this notion that our economy is based upon all of us just going out and doing some laboring and making some stuff and just trading it to others. That's not how the economy works. The economy is much, much more complex, and people are not laboring away to make all these essential items. We have machines that are automated that do much of the work. We just simply do not have a material world of individual laborers making stuff and selling them to each other so everyone can get by. Libertarians have all sorts of notions on human nature that we're selfish, self-maximizing profit seekers who must be coerced into doing any sort of labor because we're all lazy, by the way. This is like psychological proclamations without any actual psychological research. We have bizarre religious declarations that there's this invisible hand deity, and if everyone was just selfish, then somehow the world would magically work so everything is for the best. Libertarians have complete disregard for reference to the material world. So if their philosophy leads to environmental degradation, well, that's just externalities. That doesn't matter. And again, just even basic looking at reality to question if we need so much labor. Does everyone need to do all this work? What are we doing with everyone has to put in all these hours, like, or no, this bizarre job fetish that's going on in the United States with this job creation mythology. Like, you know, they have all these ideas, and yet there's no reference back to our actual world. You know, we still have all these people who believe like this Ron Paul guy or other, you know, libertarians like him who had no concept of technological unemployment. You just go to Mises.org, and that's where like Ron Paul got all this crap from. So if you're listening to some libertarian, you're listening to someone who got something from someone else, who got something from someone else who 20 years ago read Mises. So it all comes back to like this Mises guy with these extremist libertarian right-wing fanatics. And basically they said ordination would have no effect on anything. Yet, if you actually look at the world, what jobs do they expect people to do? Again, no material reference. Instead, what you get from libertarians is bizarre analogies as if, like, we're all Robinson Crusoe stuck on a desert island. They abstract the actual world in which we live away. So reality no longer exists. It's just you against the world, and you go out and you labor to produce stuff, and that's how you get by. And because you're laboring in the world to make stuff, it's obvious that you own what you produced. And when people trade, all they are just independent producers making some trades because it's beneficial to trade what I made with traded to you for what you made. And what could go wrong? Well, we have complex systems, and someone needs to tell these people about systems theory. Because with systems theory, once you have like these complex self-organizing systems, not that capitalism is that good at self-organizing things for the benefit of all humanity, but within these complex networks, you cannot predict the outcome by doing, by just looking at the reductionistic, you know, transactions. You need to kind of run the system and see what it produces. So if something doesn't work out, they just blame the government and any social safety net because, you know, fuck poor people for the failure of their system. And again, they use simple reductionism to predict complex system output, which, again, for anyone familiar with systems theory is just not possible to do. Okay, for anyone who watched this, thank you for listening to me. I hope I was coherent, but I just wanted to make the point in a very repetitive way, I guess, that libertarians do not objectively look at the world in which they talk about. It's all based upon ad hoc philosophy to justify capitalism. The idea of materialism as it exists in Marxism is not that complicated, and I think a lot of times people throw out these ideas such as the material dialectic and materialism and Marx as if it's really something unique to Marxism. It's very simple. It's just simply understanding that the material world in which we live in affects us in terms of our ideas, in terms of our ethics, in terms of our social organization, and all that stuff, and recognizing that. Something which, again, is disregarded by capitalistic philosophy, by a type of libertarian philosophy, which is disregarded by Islam and as well. And you can see that with other religions. Anyone who claims to have the perfect eternal set of ethics, I don't care whether it's talking about an economic set of ethics or a religious set of ethics, it's all bullshit because none of these ethics are eternal. They're all dependent upon the material conditions for their validity.